Imagine a symbol. Just think about it for a second. A symbol so charged, so tied up in a history of terror that just seeing it can, well, shatter someone's sense of safety, ignite real fear. Now imagine that symbol running headfirst into one of our most fundamental rights, free speech. It's more than just a legal puzzle, right? It's really about where we, as a society, draw that very fine line between expression and intimidation. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're your shortcut to getting truly informed on complex issues. Today we're tackling something incredibly nuanced, the constitutionality of banning cross burnings. Our goal here is to unpack the legal side, the history, figure out when exactly cross burning can be prohibited, and, understand how symbolic acts fit under the First Amendment. And what's really fascinating, as our sources show, is just how deeply divided the Supreme Court itself was on all this. It really exposes some fundamental disagreements about what free speech even means. We're mainly drawing from Supreme Court opinions today. The big one is Virginia v. Black from 2003. But we also need to look at an important earlier case, RAV v. City of St. Paul, and of course the historical context of cross burning itself. By the end of this, you'll have a solid handle on the issue, understanding the different perspectives, much like the justices themselves had to consider. Okay, so let's start with the symbol itself, the burning cross. Why is it so potent? So visceral. It's clearly more than just, burning wood.
Yeah, absolutely. Its power, as the sources really lay out, comes from this deeply disturbing history. It wasn't always seen this way, but over time, especially in America, it became this, potent tool of terror. Its modern association is inseparable from the Ku Klux Klan. You see it emerging strongly after the Civil War, in the 1860s and 70s. Then there's this huge resurgence starting around 1915, really boosted by that infamous film, The Klansman, later known as The Birth of a Nation. That film, it glorified the Klan, and its popularity fueled this massive comeback in the 1920s, spreading fear nationwide. And the sources are crystal clear on this. The main purpose was intimidation. It's consistently called a symbol of hate, a symbol of white supremacy. It's linked directly to violence, racial terror, intense fear. A burning cross wasn't just like an opinion. It was understood as an imminent threat. It often led to an immediate breach of peace. And, just to show how seriously this is still taken, the FBI has actually been required to track hate crime stats involving symbols like this since 1991. It's an ongoing issue.
Wow. Okay, so given that really heavy, undeniable history of intimidation, how does the law even begin to approach this? How does an act like cross burning, which is obviously symbolic, connect with the First Amendment? We think of speech as words, right? But how does the law handle actions that convey a message?
That's the core legal challenge, exactly. The First Amendment doesn't just protect words you speak or write down. It definitely extends to what the courts call symbolic conduct. Think about famous examples like burning a draft card during Vietnam protests or students wearing black armbands. Those are actions, not words, but they're meant to express a particular idea, and so they generally get First Amendment protection. But, and this is a big but, that protection isn't absolute. There are specific categories of speech, or conduct as speech, that get zero First Amendment protection. You might have heard of fighting words, speech that basically inflicts injury or is likely to start a fight right then and there, though the court has narrowed that category quite a bit over the years. For our purposes today, though, the really crucial category is true threats. A true threat is not protected speech, period. The definition is something like a serious expression of an intent to commit an act of unlawful violence to a particular individual or group of individuals. So the whole legal tightrope walk is figuring out if and when cross-burning stops being just offensive symbolic speech and becomes an unprotected true threat.
Right, that makes sense. And this is where it gets even trickier, isn't it? Because before the big Virginia v. Black case we mentioned, there was this other really important ruling, RAV City of St. Paul, back in 1992. What happened in RAV, and why did it make things so difficult for states like Virginia that wanted to regulate cross-burning?
Yes, RAV is absolutely key background here.
Yeah.
So the city of St. Paul, Minnesota had passed an ordinance. It basically prohibited displaying symbols, and it specifically mentioned things like a burning cross or a swastika if you displayed them in a way that you knew or should know would arouse anger, alarm, or resentment based on things like race, color, creed, religion, or gender.
Right.
In essence, St. Paul was trying to ban hate speech, right? Symbols known to cause offense based on group identity, but the Supreme Court struck it down, said it was unconstitutional. And the reason why is critical. The court found the ordinance was content-based.
Content-based, what does that mean in this context?
It means the law wasn't just regulating, say, all threatening conduct or even the act of displaying symbols in a disruptive way. Instead, it specifically targeted speech based on the message it conveyed in this case. Messages expressing hatred towards certain groups. The general rule under the First Amendment is that the government can't forbid speech just because it disapproves of the ideas being expressed, even really hateful ideas. So, while everyone on the court agreed the message was abhorrent, the law itself was seen as picking sides, targeting specific viewpoints. And that's generally a no-go under the First Amendment. This RAV ruling basically sent a strong signal. You can't easily ban symbols just because they express hateful messages. That created a real obstacle for states wanting to prohibit cross-burning, because cross-burning is often about expressing a hateful message.
Okay, so that RAV case really set the stage, highlighting how tough it is to target speech based on its message. So bearing that in mind, let's finally get to the main event, Virginia v. Black. What actually happened in that case? What were the specific facts, and what exactly was Virginia trying to do with its cross-burning law?
Right. Virginia v. Black wasn't just one incident. It actually brought together 3 separate situations under the same Virginia law, which gave the court a pretty broad perspective. In one instance, you had Barry Black, who was identified as a KKK leader. He held a rally in a place called Carroll County, Virginia. And at this rally, they burned a pretty large cross, the sources say 25 to 30 feet tall, out in an open field. Then, completely separately, over in Virginia Beach, you had 2 other individuals, Richard Elliott and Jonathan O'Mara. Apparently, after some kind of dispute with a neighbor, they burned a smaller cross in that neighbor's yard.
Okay, so different context there. What did the Virginia law actually say?
Virginia had a specific statute, Section 18.2423. It made it illegal for anyone to burn a cross on someone else's property or on a highway or any other public place with the intent to intimidate any person or group. That intent to intimidate part was really important. The law wasn't banning all cross burning, just burning done with that specific purpose. But here's the part that caused all the constitutional fireworks. The law included what's called a prima facie evidence provision.
Prima facie, what does that mean?
It essentially means on first appearance, or at first sight. The law stated that any burning of a cross covered by the statute shall be prima facie evidence of an intent to intimidate. So, what that did was create a legal presumption. If you burned a cross in public or on someone else's property, the act itself was automatically considered evidence that you intended to intimidate. The burden then shifted to the defendant to prove they didn't have that intent. That presumption was the really controversial piece.
Ah, I see. So the act itself implies the illegal intent. Given what the court said in RAV about not targeting messages, how did they possibly square that with a law that seemed to single out one specific symbol, the cross, and presume intent based on its history? That sounds like a constitutional minefield.
It absolutely was. And the court really had to perform a delicate balancing act. This led to that split decision we mentioned, where they sort of agreed with Virginia on one part but disagreed on another. Justice O'Connor wrote the main opinion for the court. So here's the first part. The court actually upheld the core idea that Virginia could ban cross-burning when it's done with a specific intent to intimidate. It said this isn't like the St. Paul law in RAV.
How did they distinguish it?
They argued that Virginia wasn't banning the cross because of its hateful message as such. Instead, it was banning the conduct of intimidation. Burning a cross with the intent to intimidate, they said, qualifies as a true threat. And as we discussed, true threats are not protected by the First Amendment. So if the state can prove you burned that cross specifically to make someone fear violence, that's a crime. That part was okay.
Okay, so banning cross-burning with proven intent to intimidate is constitutional. What part wasn't?
The prima facie clause. That part got struck down. The court said that specific provision, the one that allowed a jury to automatically infer the intent to intimidate just from the act of burning the cross, was unconstitutional.
Why? What was the problem with that presumption?
The majority's concern was that this presumption swept too broadly. It risked punishing people for cross-burning that might not have been intended as a threat, but was perhaps a symbolic speech protected by the First Amendment. Justice O'Connor noted that while cross-burning is often intended to intimidate, it's not always the case. She gave an example. Maybe a group burns a cross at a private rally purely as a statement of group solidarity, with no intention of threatening anyone outside the group. The prima facie clause didn't allow for that distinction. It basically created a sort of blanket prohibition by assuming the worst intent from the act alone. You couldn't automatically conclude intent to intimidate just because a cross was burned. The state still had to prove that specific intent independently.
It's like you can't assume someone carrying matches intends to commit arson, right? You need more evidence of their intent.
That's a decent analogy, yeah. The act itself wasn't enough. The specific criminal intent, the intent to intimidate, had to be proven separately. That presumption violated the First Amendment by potentially chilling or punishing protected speech.
That's a really fine line the court drew there. But then, You mentioned a dissent. Justice Thomas had a completely different take on this, especially on that prima facie clause.
Oh, completely different. Justice Thomas wrote a very powerful dissent. He fundamentally disagreed with striking down that prima facie provision. He thought the entire Virginia statute should have been upheld. His argument was rooted very deeply in the history we talked about. He argued that cross burning, especially in public, isn't just sometimes intimidating. It is inherently an act of intimidation because of its history. Full stop. He emphasized its inseparable link to the KKK, to decades, even centuries, of racial terror and violence. He called it a unique symbol of white supremacy, and argued that its historical context means that the act of burning a cross itself functions as a true threat.
So for him, the history dictates the intent.
Essentially, yes. He argued that given this unique and terrifying history, there's basically no First Amendment right to burn a cross in most contexts. He saw it almost exclusively as conduct designed to terrorize. Therefore, he believed the prima facie provision was perfectly constitutional. He felt it rightly recognized the reality that when someone burns a cross in public, the intent to intimidate is almost always present. Requiring the state to prove intent beyond the act itself, in his view, ignored the symbol's potent history and weakened the law's ability to protect people from fear and violence.
Wow. Two very different ways of looking at the same act and the same history, leading to different conclusions about the First Amendment. So, pulling this all together, what does this mean for you, the listener? Why does this careful parsing of the act versus the intent matter so much for how we understand free speech today?
Yeah, it really boils down to a few key takeaways for understanding this complex area. First, the court drew this incredibly sharp line. Cross-burning as symbolic speech gets First Amendment protection, unless the government can prove it was done with the specific intent to intimidate. The act itself isn't automatically illegal just because it's offensive or has this terrible history. It's that specific proven intent that pushes it over the line into unprotected, true threat territory.
Okay, so intent is paramount. What else?
Second, the burden of proof is critical. The government can't just point to the burning cross and say, see, intimidation. That prima facie clause being struck down means the state has to come up with independent evidence to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that the person actually intended to intimidate someone. This protects speech, even offensive speech, from being too easily criminalized based on assumptions. The worry is, if the government can just assume intent, people might hold back from expressing unpopular views for fear of being misunderstood or wrongly prosecuted. That's the chilling effect.
Right, the chilling effect on potentially protected speech.
Exactly. And third, this whole deep dive just underscores this constant tension in American law. We want to protect free speech, even speech we hate, right? But we also absolutely need to protect people from genuine threats, from terror, from intimidation. Virginia v. Black is all about trying to find that balance point. It's about drawing lines very carefully to prevent government censorship and to prevent people from using symbols to terrorize others. It forces us to really think about context, history, and the specific mindset behind an action when we interpret these powerful symbols.
It really does. This exploration of cross-burning and the First Amendment shows just how delicate that line between protected expression and unprotected intimidation truly is, and how it's constantly being debated and redrawn, and it makes you think, doesn't it? In our world today, which is increasingly digital, how do these principles even apply? How do we handle online symbols or threats that spread instantly and maybe have an even broader chilling effect? Are there other historical symbols out there beyond the cross that carry such an inherent weight of intimidation that maybe their display should be seen as a true threat, regardless of easily provable intent? That's something to really mull over, how these legal ideas adapt or struggle to adapt to new forms of communication and the enduring power of symbols in our society.